Good evening, everyone. Welcome again to our continuing discussion on why would I believe that, looking at whether or not it makes logical sense from an evidence-based standpoint and even a science-based standpoint to believe in a creator, a superior entity, or not. And so I appreciate your being with us again this evening. If you're watching live, it's August the 30th, 2020. And we're homing in on the last few weeks of this. After tonight, we'll have 2 more sessions to wrap this thing up. And I think what you're going to see tonight, especially tonight and next week, may be very, very eye-opening for you. Now, I'm not going to spend even the few minutes that we usually do reviewing, except just the quickest. We're looking at a question that is of great importance to every single human on this planet. Is there a superior entity? Is there a creator? Does it make sense to believe that? And we've broken that down into 4 different phenomena or things that require explanation, either because of the action of a superior entity with intelligent design and creation, or by naturalistic causes and mechanisms without the existence of any superior entity. So we started last week on the 4th of these questions, and that is the diversity and complexity and precision of function of life that we see all around us, including the human and everything else on this planet. How did that happen? And of course, we've covered the first 3 questions in some detail in our previous sessions. So we're on that last one, and we're looking at these theories. There is the superior entity hypothesis, or intelligent design or creation. That is, God created the life that we see, and He created it pretty much in the form that we see it, not through any ongoing process. There is an alternative to that called theistic evolution, which is to say that there was a God or a creator involved, and that would satisfy the first 3 of our major questions: the existence and design of the universe and the initial appearance of life from non-living material. And the idea there is that a God, a superior entity, did those things, but He only created the simplest life and then let a process of evolution turn it into what we see now. So it's kind of a hybrid. It's evolution with God at the beginning of it, but then hands off for the rest of it. For primary atheistic theories, the one that is still very prominently, widely held, we'll just call it evolution just for shorthand, but it's really macroevolution or neo-Darwinism by natural selection from an ongoing series of genetic mutations. And then, as we'll see tonight, there is an alternative to that under the naturalistic or non-superior entity category called punctuated equilibrium, and we'll take a look at that. Now, again, the creation or superior entity hypothesis is that there is a supernatural and eternally existing entity who created all that physically exists. We've talked about that before. Looking then again at the current evolution theory, neo-Darwinism or macroevolution hypothesis, that once primitive life existed by some means, abiogenesis, if you believe that took place, etc., it underwent a long and unending series of genetic mutations, which are still occurring, some of which proved beneficial and thus were preserved and propagated by natural selection because they conferred a survival advantage on that organism. So these then eventually gave rise to greater changes, more complexity, added genetic material, more chromosomes, and the appearance of whole new species, plants, animals, and everything that we see. So those are kind of the 2 things that we're looking at. Now, our consideration of evolution, as you know, I've broken it down this way. First of all, we looked at 2 weeks ago, the unique premises and treatment of this theory, because this theory gets treated like nothing else in all of the scientific realm. We looked at that. It's quite astounding, really. And so you may want to go back and take a look at that if you weren't with us for that. The next will be the foundational assumptions of evolution. We looked at those last week, and I don't know if you've ever really thought about that or put them in order like that before, because evolution, the theory, is usually promoted not based on evidence, but based on the assumptions. So we looked at those last week, and I'm not going to go through our discussion of those again, but I want to just quickly tell you what they were. And here were the way, at least, that I've broken this down, and it's just my thinking and my organization, so it may not be the greatest, but it does work to cover things pretty thoroughly. So the first one was, anything that can be conjectured is possible, no matter how unlikely it is. And in this case, we're saying that random genetic mutations can produce useful new anatomic features and physiologic functions. Okay? So we went through that, looked at some illustrations, etc. And then the second assumption that evolution is based on is, therefore, given enough time, anything that can be conjectured eventually will happen. And everybody agrees that beneficial genetic mutations are extremely rare. Nobody disagrees on that, okay? But the idea is that if you give it enough time, some good ones will happen, some really good ones, and enough of them will happen that you can get a useful new anatomic feature. Maybe you can grow lungs in an animal that didn't have lungs, or a four-chambered heart that's self-adjusting, etc., whatever. So the idea is then that if you give it enough time, it eventually will happen, no matter how unlikely, and that these things, once they do occur, they will be preserved, and then they will become more and more prominent until that becomes the new normal for that species, etc. The third one is, given enough time, and again, they do throw in the old parallel universes here, multiple millions of universes to increase the odds of it happening, supposedly. So given enough time and maybe some parallel universes, it'll happen again and again. And there will be an unending procession of these beneficial mutations, which will build advantage upon advantage and yield major changes and even new species. And the other part of the assumption is that there has been enough time for this to occur. The fourth one is that so-called microevolution, which we will come back and look at more, that is small changes where you see an organism so perfectly or near perfectly adapted to its environment, and you can see some changes take place, the color of a moth, the size and shape of a finch's beak, etc. So some people call these microevolution. So supposedly then, the existence of those phenomena confirms the first three assumptions, and it reliably implies the occurrence of the whole, big evolutionary theory, macroevolution. The idea is, if we can see significant changes occurring in a short period of time, well, then it's just obvious that by extrapolation, this proves those first three assumptions, and it makes the whole theory obviously true over enough time. Okay? And the last one is then, therefore, that's what happened. Because of these assumptions, well, it's possible, and therefore that's what happened, even no matter how improbable it is. And it has to be true because, let's misuse the anthropic principle again. Hey, it must be true because we're here, and there's no other explanation, so it must be true. And we've talked about the inherent fallacy in that. Well, we looked at those assumptions then, and we went through them in some detail. And if you didn't see session 10, I hope that you will look at that, because you need to understand these assumptions and realize that this is the way this theory is usually promoted, not on evidence. You won't really hear people talk about, and certainly you'll hear very few people ever critique the evidence like we're about to embark on here in just a minute. But not only are these assumptions very widely held, but the first three in particular, they're usually presented as just, hey, that's just obviously true. We don't even need to talk about it. Of course, we talked about it and found that they're not valid assumptions. And then anyone who questions those last two assumptions is frequently dismissed as just some kind of a pathetic, ignorant moron, or worse than that sometimes. Which is just out of place, as we've talked about. You know how I feel about that. All right, now, even though we showed very logically that these assumptions are not valid, they cannot be accepted as assumed true, as automatically true, that doesn't mean that there's no possibility of the evolutionary theory being correct. It just means that we can't automatically assume it to be correct, okay? But it does deserve our serious attention. As mentioned, even though when Mr. Darwin put this theory forth in 1859, at that point it was completely unfalsifiable. There was no way to potentially test it or potentially falsify it, disprove it, but it got accepted anyway. But now it is potentially falsifiable. And so, in all fairness, well, let's just say that it's possible, okay? Never mind the assumptions. We're not going to assume it's true. We found that those assumptions were not really very valid at all. But let's say it's possible, and we should give it serious consideration based not on assumptions, but on evidence. Now, let me point out, because this is important to keep in mind, evolution, just like creation, intelligent design, okay? It cannot be directly tested. That would be the scientific method. It cannot be directly observed, because if it did take place, it was over, a very long span of years, millions and millions, maybe billions of years. So you can't directly observe it. None of us were there. And therefore, it's not actually science. I mean, by actual definition of science, evolutionary theory is not science. It is not scientific. Now, it's no less important because of that, but if somebody tells you, no, I can't believe in intelligent design and a superior entity, I only believe in science. Well, evolution's no more science than that is. Neither of them are. The difference is they're both beyond the boundaries of human science. One of them is you might find compatible with what we find scientifically, even though it's beyond science. And we're looking tonight to see how does evolution stack up, okay? So we can examine other evidence, just like we talked about in our first few sessions, to see if we can disprove this theory or find it to be validated, I should say. Sorry about making up a word there. And really bolstered and supported as being likely true. So I don't know what could be more fair than actually scrutinizing the evidence for and against the evolutionary theory. Isn't that what we would want to do with anything? I mean, what could be more fair than that? What could be more logical, or even, you might say, scientific, even though this is beyond science, but we can look at it in that way. So that's what I want us to do. Let's look at the evidence and let it speak. Okay? So based on that analysis, here are the questions then that we need to answer about the evolutionary theory by looking at the evidence. Does this theory, this story, have credibility? Should we find a reason to believe it, like, yep, evolution looks to be true? Does the evidence support it so that it would have that credibility? Does it make more sense and have greater explanatory power for the life that we see around us than the competing hypotheses do? Okay, that's where we want to go with this, just like we would with any kind of an important question. Okay, so we have to examine and evaluate the evidence for ourselves. And I will tell you this, you might say, well, I don't have to. I already read, a textbook said it was true, and in fact, it said it was a proven fact. Yeah, you better read some more, because if you only read the headlines and the conclusions, you will learn, I put that in quote marks here, that the evidence for evolution is rock solid, it's incontrovertible, the theory is actually a fact, and anyone who questions it is having, I'm not making this up, this is from very prominent atheist and evolution believers. If you question evolution, you're having a creationist tantrum. That's all it is. You're not having any kind of a logical inquiry or thought process. You're just having a creationist tantrum, okay? And anyone who denies evolution as being factual is either, this is from Richard Dawkins, either stupid, ignorant, insane, or perhaps wicked, although he said, I'd rather not think about that. All right? You know what? I'm just going to look at the evidence anyway. Call me whatever you want, but no matter what you tell me in this life, especially if it's something that borders on scientific things or whatever, I want to see the evidence. You call me what you want, okay? So even beyond the arrogance and the vitriol of some of those statements, I mean, does that sound like a rational and intellectually honest search for the truth to you? Or does it sound like somebody's trying to squash the competing hypotheses and make sure you're afraid to consider them? Okay, I don't like the way this thing gets handled, but we're going to do differently because we're going to look at the evidence. All right, so here we go. Excuse me. So our consideration of evolution as we move down, we move past those assumptions. We're now ready to look at a critical analysis of the evidence, and I'm going to break that down into 5 parts of this, not 5 weeks again, don't be scared. But here's the way I'm going to break this down. Now, again, this is just my way of organizing my thoughts on this. You could look at it any number of different ways and organize your own outline for it, but at least maybe this one will serve to walk us through it, because I want us to be thorough in the scope of what we cover, even though we'll have to do just the briefest review of these. So my idea with this is to present to you every important facet, pro, con, etc., about evidence for evolution, even though we won't be able to give it nearly as much attention to as I would like to them. But you'll know then, if you want to go read some more, you'll know that you haven't missed anything. You're just going to go back and expand it, okay? So here's what I'm going to suggest. First of all, let's look at the affirmatively supporting hypothesis-specific evidence to support evolution. Number 2, we'll look at the missing evidence, things that we'd like to see but don't. Number 3, the contradictory evidence. Number 4, what I'm going to call the shifting evidence. You'll see that. And number 5, the rational and convincing proposed mechanisms for evolution. Now, I've told you before, I happen to think that, at least for Mr. Darwin's day, this was a I think a reasonably well thought out theory. I think it was very imaginative, there's no doubt about that. Actually, I think it was pretty clever for Mr. Darwin's day. Now, things have changed and we have a lot more knowledge now, but it's an intriguing theory and one that I'm very happy to give serious, fair consideration to. And so that's where we want to go with that. All right. So let's take a look at that first one then, the affirmatively supporting hypothesis-specific evidence for evolution. And here's what I mean by that. Affirmatively supporting, I mean things that definitely support evolution, not just things that could be consistent with it. I mean things that say, yes, this definitely points to support evolutionary theory. And hypothesis-specific, what I mean by that is I'm looking for evidence that doesn't support both creation by a superior entity, intelligent design, and evolution. If it supports both of them, then that's not really evidence for either one. So you see what I mean by the affirmatively supporting hypothesis-specific evidence. Things that definitely support the evolutionary theory and don't support creation instead. And you're looking at the list in that box right there of the evidence that meets that criteria. Yeah, and if you notice the box seems to be empty, correct. There isn't any. Now, you might be tempted to say, oh, well, you just say that because you want to believe in creation. No, let's take a look. I don't say anything because I want to believe in. I don't want to believe anything except what makes sense and what looks like it's true, to the very best of my ability to sort it out, okay, and try to disprove it. There's not any affirmatively supporting hypothesis-specific evidence for evolution. And you can get indignant if you want, but, let's go through this. If you know of some, I'd sure like to know it, because I have spent hundreds of hours, many, many hundreds of hours over many years looking for it, and I can't find it. And I've read every evolutionist, I mean everything you can imagine. You got to be fair, you got to be open-minded, you got to be searching. And I can't find it. Now, here's what the fact is, though, and when you see the statement, you'll realize, oh, yeah. Okay, the fact is that all of the evidence that's typically claimed as illustrating evolution, that is, for example, animals that just have an uncanny adaptation to their environment. And there are many. The examples are amazing. They used to say, you see, that's the evidence for evolution. This animal, its eyes are exactly what they need to be for the environment that it lives in, etc. The problem is that all those things are at least as compatible with design by a superior entity. In some cases, you might say, if not more so. Some of these things very strongly suggestive of design. There is no evidence that specifically and affirmatively supports macroevolution. Example, the platypus. This is one that you'll hear about. I mean, it just, what an amazing animal. If you want to just be blown away, go read about the platypus, okay? If the platypus is an amazing organism that is seemingly just perfect for its environment, just so perfectly adapted, is that consistent with evolutionary theory? Because it's one of the examples we see. And is it specific for evolution, like we talked about a moment ago? Well, the answers are, is it consistent with evolutionary theory? Yes, yes. The idea is, if evolutionary theory were true, then you would expect to see, if there had been enough time, you would expect to see organisms like a platypus that's just so remarkably perfect for its life and environment. So yes, it's consistent with evolutionary theory. Is it specific for evolution? No. No, because if design by a superior entity is the correct answer, then you would expect to see amazing organisms like the platypus that are just perfectly adapted and fitting for their environment, etc. All right? So let's just try that then to prove the point. If the platypus is an amazing organism that's seemingly perfect for its environment, is that consistent with intelligent design theory by a superior entity? And is it specific for intelligent design? Well, here are the answers. Consistent with intelligent design theory? Oh, yes. Highly consistent, perfectly consistent. Is it specific for intelligent design? No. It could have happened by evolution if evolution is true. I would say it's very strongly suggestive of intelligent design by an outside action, but it's not specific for that. It could be evolution if evolution is true. So you can look at a million different examples then, but I think you get the idea with that. The fact is that all of the evidence that's typically claimed as illustrating evolution is at least as compatible with design by a superior entity. In fact, that would be the strongest and first inference that should be made by looking at the evidence, okay? And there is no evidence that uniquely supports macroevolution. Now, we will come back and specifically discuss, as I've told you before, why microevolution, that is natural selection and adaptation, etc., small changes, does not correlate. You know, that fourth assumption we looked at, they do not correlate with actual evolution or macroevolution. And so we'll look at things like the supposed evidence of vestigial organs, all of those. Oh, we're not going to leave anything out. And believe me, I'm going to put everything in here that could chip away at the superior entity hypothesis too. I try to be fair, okay? So we're not going to overlook any of that. You may just see some of that come up a little bit later on. So the thing is, there's not any affirmatively supporting hypothesis-specific evidence for evolution. And I know that may come as a big blow, and in fact, a big surprise to a lot of people, because you've been told that, I mean, it's just an airtight case. It's not. Well, let's look at, in my organization here, let's come to the next one, the missing evidence for evolution. Here's what I mean by that. Things that should be seen, that we should be able to observe if the evolutionary theory is correct, but they're conspicuously absent instead. Okay? Because if this theory is correct, and we've had this theory for 160 years now, in fact, if you look at some of the underpinnings that came before Mr. Darwin, longer than that. But 160 years for sure since Mr. Darwin put this theory forth. And then with genetic knowledge and discovery, it tweaked a little bit, but it really just kind of fleshed out his original theory into what we now call neo-Darwinism. But we ought to see some things that are not there. There should be specific, affirmatively supporting evidence. We just don't have it. All right? So, as I say on here, given Darwin's theory of gradualism, just tiny, tiny changes, and later on we would say due to genetic mutations. So the slightly more precise mutation mechanism that we now have proposed for it in Neo-Darwinism. In 160 years of, very vigorous research and discovery work, great advancements in genetic knowledge, we should now, and geology as well, another 160 years to dig for fossils. And that was already a very active field of science, even in Darwin's day. But, nothing like now. Another 160 years to dig for fossils. Man, we ought to be all over this thing. We should now have a wealth of supporting fossil evidence, as well as numerous clear examples of mutations, random mutations, producing survival advantageous new anatomic features and physiologic functions, just like Darwin predicted in his theory. We should now be able to just throw out enough examples of that you, the next 3 weeks, 24 hours a day, you wouldn't be able to look at them all. So where are they? Still, the fossil record contains none of this evidence of gradual changes. And I will tell you that several noted evolutionary paleontologists, and I mean staunch evolution believers, most of them staunch atheists, not creation believers having a creationist tantrum, etc. No pseudoscience here. Noted evolutionary paleontologists have acknowledged that all of the actual fossil evidence of these, like primate, especially monkeys to man transitional forms, would fit in a shoebox. That's how many bones they actually have. It would fit in a shoebox with enough room left over for a pair of shoes. I'm not making that up. Okay? These are evolutionists who have quietly acknowledged this. I think you probably know by now, okay, you don't see it published anymore, but we used to see that famous artistic progression of it started on the left-hand end with a chimp or something, walking on all fours. And then the next one, he had his front paws off or legs off the ground. He still, looked like a chimpanzee, etc. And then about six little pictures later, he's more and more, looking like a human and standing upright. And then on the right-hand end of the little diagram, you have, a human man walking around. Well, I think that was totally fabricated. If you don't know that, please be aware of that. That was always a total fabrication, and unfortunately, it got published in one textbook after another by the thousands, okay? And it was never anything except an artist thought, well, hey, maybe it looked kind of like this. Kind of like an artist's conception of here's what the first colony on Mars might look like. Well, that's nice, but it's not true, okay? That picture was made up, but see, you've always been told that it was based on lots of evidence. It's not. Please go and check me out on this. Go and prove me wrong. But the problem is, the sad part for evolutionary theory is, I'm not wrong about this. This is the truth. The evidence is not there. It ought to be there, but it's not. Let me tell you, I'll read to you a quote, actually, before I go into this one. Here's what Charles Darwin said. You'll see another of his quotes in just a second here, but let me tell you this one. This is a direct quote, Charles Darwin. The number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed must be truly enormous. Okay, let me break for a second, because his theory, tiny gradual changes, and later we say due to one genetic mutation at a time. So yeah, there would have to be millions of different species, each one just a little different. An eye that's just a little bit formed, and then the next one maybe has a little bit more of an eye, etc. You get the picture. but there have to be all kinds of existing species. So he says the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and serious objection which can be argued against this theory, his theory of evolution. Yeah, Mr. Darwin, you can read some of his later writings, and it looks like he's kind of full of himself, but he was pretty famous by then too. But he did honestly acknowledge some things and the potential implications of those things. He said, look, if my theory's true, there should be untold millions of fossils in the geological record of these intermediate forms, just each one just a little bit different from the last one. And he said, and they are surely not there. We have not seen them. He says, and this is the most serious and most obvious objection against my theory. Well, he got that right. But here's the thing, as you'll see in a moment, Mr. Darwin assumed that his theory was correct despite that there was no fossil evidence for it, as he himself said there should be. But his assumption was, we just haven't dug enough yet. This is geology. Paleontology is still a fairly new science or branch of research. We will find them. They've got to be there, or his theory's no good. He said that. And he said, so his assumption was, we will find them. All right? Now let me fast forward to Dr. Stephen Jay Gould. Now, I don't ever want to be guilty or accused of misquoting people or of taking them out of context. A favorite game of people is to say that if you use the writings and the quotes of evolutionists and atheists, which tend to undermine atheistic evolutionary theory, well, you're misquoting them or you're taking them out of context. No, I'm not doing either one. Dr. Gould was at Harvard for many years, and I do not remember his exact title, but he was chair of their paleontology studies and department, etc. He was an atheist. Actually, from what I can read, he was known for being a really decent person. Very generous, etc. And notably, he had no problem with people who held religious belief. He was not one of them, but he didn't have a problem with them. He didn't feel like they were evil and stupid. In fact, Dr. Gould kind of thought science and religion or faith are two totally separate things. They do not overlap, but neither one should be a problem for the other. That was kind of his thought. And a lot of people didn't like that because they wanted him to be a whole lot more actively atheistic than that, okay? But Dr. Gould was evidently just a keen, astute, and honest observer of what he saw. So he was an atheist, he believed in evolution, but he realized, plain and simple, Darwin's theory is not true. The evidence does not support it, and he had the guts to stand up and say that, okay? In fact, he proposed something different because he still wanted to believe in evolution, but he knew that the widely accepted and the one that's still widely accepted, despite him, he knew it wasn't true because it couldn't be. It was not consistent with the evidence. So let me show you on the next 4 slides a quote from Dr. Gould, and embedded in this is yet another quote from Charles Darwin. What Dr. Gould is talking about here is the conspicuous absence of transitional forms in the fossil record that have to be there if Darwin's theory is to be true. And he says what you're about to see is he's kind of like, look, we don't say it much, but we all know it, okay? Those of us who study the fossil record, we all know it's not there. We just don't like to admit that, all right? So look at what Dr. Gould says, including his embedded quote of Charles Darwin. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference. However reasonable, it's not the evidence of fossils. Yet Darwin was so wedded to gradualism, that is, the endless procession of gradual, slow changes. Darwin was so wedded to gradualism that he wagered his entire theory on a denial of this literal fossil record. Here's Darwin. The geological record is extremely imperfect, that is, incomplete, okay? And this fact will, to a large extent, explain why we do not find interminable varieties connecting together all the extinct and existing forms of life by the finest graduated steps. So he's saying, we just haven't found the fossils yet because we haven't dug enough, okay? Because we've got to find them, and like he said before, if we don't find them, then you really ought to reject my theory, okay? And here he says, I think we haven't found them just because we're not there yet, but we will find them. But then he concludes, he says, he who rejects these views on the nature, the incompleteness of the geological record will rightly reject my whole theory. So Dr. Gould quotes him now back to Dr. Gould. Darwin's argument still persists as the favored escape of most paleontologists from the embarrassment of a record that seems to show so little of evolution. In exposing its cultural and methodological roots, I wish in no way to impugn the potential validity of gradualism, for all general views have similar roots. I wish only to point out that it was never seen in the rocks. So you see what Dr. Gould is saying? He goes, look, I'm not criticizing Darwin's theory. I'm just telling you it doesn't fit the evidence, okay? That's, you might say, kind of an irony or a contradiction there. But he did not want to step on the toes of his evolutionary colleagues. He just says, but I'm just pointing out the evidence is not there. We've never seen it in the rocks, okay? And then concluding, he says, paleontologists have paid an exorbitant price for Darwin's argument. We fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history, yet to preserve our favored account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as so bad that we never see the very process we profess to study. He says we all make our careers talking about how evolution happened, and yet we have to admit we've never seen any evidence for it. Now that is a very telling admission, and I'm not taking it out of context. Dr. Gould just said what everybody else knew but never would say. He goes, something's wrong here. We all believe in evolution, but the evidence does not support it. All right? I'm going to take a minute, and I'm going to read you two others. I didn't put these on the slides, but let me read you this one. Evolutionary zoologist, okay, evolution believer, Mark Ridley at Oxford University, says, no real evolutionist, whether gradualistic or punctuationist, we're going to come back to that, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. He goes, look, we all know no real evolutionist would ever try to quote the fossil record as evidence to support it, because we all know it doesn't support the theory. All right? Here's another one. There was Dr. Colin Patterson, who actually wrote a well-known textbook on evolution. He was a paleontologist. He was the editor of the professional journal of the British Museum of Natural History. Okay, big time guy. Wrote the book on evolution. And so he put out a new edition of his textbook, and somebody got his textbook and wrote him a letter saying, how come he didn't include any examples of the transitional fossils they all talk about? He wrote back, and this is published, he wrote back to the person who wrote the letter, he said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Yet, Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. I could go on and on and on. So, but we're now told, despite all of that you see, and some of the comments I showed you a moment ago from Dr. Gould were in 1977, but we're now told routinely that, oh yeah, the fossil record, oh, it supports evolutionary theory just, oh, beautifully, perfectly, oh, yeah, no question, okay? So was something substantial unearthed since Gould's statement in 1977 and all of these others, honest assessments of the total lack of evidence? I mean, and can we see at least just maybe a few solid examples to convince us that all of the millions of others are out there somewhere once we finally dig in the right place? Oh, and by the way, Richard Dawkins, when confronted with this, he goes, oh, they're there. We're just, they migrated, but, away from where we're digging. Essentially, we're digging in the wrong place. The evolution, it was just somewhere else. We just haven't dug there yet, but we'll find it, okay? So, has something changed since 77 to now tell us that, oh, no, now the fossil record does support the theory? No, nothing's changed. Nothing of any substance has been found since then, not at all. Instead, I think people just realize, oh, look, this is a losing argument. Let's just say it's, that we're not going to talk about that anymore. So a decision was just kind of quietly made to simply ignore the glaring deficiency in the fossil record and just claim that, oh, we don't need anything further. In fact, you will find that a growing number of prominent evolution advocates now will just say, well, it doesn't matter whether we find fossil evidence because we know the theory is fact. So, well, hey, what's to dig for? We know it's a fact. We don't need to dig up anything. No, that's just circular reasoning. I'm interested in evidence. And in this case, the glaring absence of evidence is a serious piece of evidence against the theory because it has to be there if the theory is true. Even Darwin said so, okay? So the lack of evidence in the fossil record, it's not only a glaring discrepancy at this point, but it's a fatal flaw. The theory cannot be true. As Mr. Darwin noted, if the interminable, that is just never-ending, varieties connecting together all the extinct and existing forms of life by the finest graduated steps, if that, as predicted for the theory, are not found, the theory is effectively falsified. And that is exactly the case. That's not the only thing that's missing, not the only problem. The problem is that like a symphony or a computer program, when you change something, it's not known to lead to good things happening, all right? And people who spend lots of their time trying to debug problems in computer systems, they know you get a line or even a few letters of computer code corrupted, this is not going to be a good thing, okay? Much less are DNA mutations known to lead to useful good things appearing, all right? Let's illustrate that. I tell you what, and the idea here is that mutations in DNA generally are not good, but the evolutionary theory holds that often enough you get one that's really good and another one to create something, better and more complex than what existed first. Doesn't have to be the same, but it's better. Well, here's what I'm going to do. I've got a magnetic board here and a bag full of stick-on magnetic letters and numbers, right? And so what I'm going to do, I could have put anything. I've just put a sentence on the board here that says, DNA is the key to life. That seemed fitting, I thought, for what we're doing. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to maybe like 7 or 8 of these, I'm going to randomly mutate a letter at a time. So, and by the way, I put a dash here to represent a blank space. So DNA blank space IS blank space THE. You get the picture. All right. So what I'm going to do is kind of close my eyes, and I'm going to pick one to change. And then what I'm going to do is just reach in this bag and just randomly put a different one in there, just like a DNA mutation, and see. Now, I'm not saying that when we do 7 or 8 of those that the sentence is going to read the same. No. The question is, will we have a useful sentence or useful information, okay? So, and I have not rehearsed this. We'll see how this goes. It may be a horrible catastrophe. I mean, because the whole thing may go wrong. But we ought to learn something. Totally unrehearsed. So each time I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to touch over here, and whatever I touch, I'm going to change that one for a random one, okay? The E right there that's what's going to get mutated. Now I'm going to just randomly reach in the bag, and whatever I pick up is going where that E was. All right, I got an M. All right, so that's 1. All right, let me just close my eyes, and I'm not cheating, and there's no point if I did, okay? Actually, I touched the same one again. So the M that I just put out there, it gets pulled away, and randomly I've got an O. All right, so there we go. DNA is the key to life. Okay, so that was 2. All right, I'm going to touch somewhere. Okay, blank space is what I pulled off. So randomly select something to go there, and it's an O. All right, so that was 3. Let me see. What have I got here? Pull off an O from the bottom. Randomly dig. I got a 6. Well, I don't know if that's a 6 or a 9. I'm going to call it a 6, okay? Let's do another one. The D at the start of DNA. Let's see what I get. All right. I got M. MNA. MNA should be as good as DNA, I think. Okay, let's do another one. The I in life. And we're going to have, it's going to be an N instead. Do maybe 1 or 2 more. We got the T right there. Gotta get it random to go. Q. All right, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think that was about 6 of them. So let's take a look at what we got. Is this useful information? MNAO. IS, you could still figure that was maybe is blank. QHO blank key, the word key, okay, we've got that. Blank key T6 LNFE. I'm not making much out of that. Like I said, like a symphony where you go in and you just start changing notes at random, I don't want to listen to that symphony. A computer program, I spent years debugging computer programs. Bad things happen when somebody corrupts your code, either the machine or your classmate, okay? It's not usually something good. Well, you get the idea. So we're depending on this process to actually turn up enough really good stuff to grow new anatomic features that weren't there before, to create a human eye and a human brain, and insects' legs that can actually suction attach them to the ceiling, and wings they can fly, etc. Yeah, it's counterintuitive for sure. And the record doesn't support it. But, we should have, if this theory is correct, we should have innumerable examples of good genetic mutations, since it's supposedly happening despite the unlikelihood of it, supposedly it's happening with surprising speed and frequency, and it would have to be to achieve the life that we see on this planet, okay? So, we should have some examples of it, shouldn't we? Well, and here are the examples that are usually claimed. Sickle cell anemia trait, because it makes you a little bit resistant to certain malaria organisms, and nylon-eating bacteria. Now, you may say, oh, no, that's not the only 2. Okay, good point. There are some others that I'm going to address a little bit later, and you'll see why. Color-changing moths and other animals, insects, et cetera, that can change their color to blend in, like camouflage, et cetera. Okay, that's obviously useful, obviously. Antibiotic resistance among bacteria, pesticide resistance among insects, changing beaks of the finch, just like Darwin saw on the Galapagos Islands. the production of antibodies in your immune system. Those are all important. You'll see a bit later why I'm not including them right now, but we will consider them. So, but the two that we're kind of left with, I mean, you would think that there should be catalogs of thousands, if not millions of them, right? You know, here's the genetic mutation sequence that led, fish to grow legs and walk on land. And here's how they grew lungs so they could breathe and not die when they came on the land, etc. But here's what we have: sickle cell anemia and nylon-eating bacteria. Well, let's talk about sickle cell anemia trait. Number one, it doesn't produce a new feature or function. If you have one of the genes, at least one bad gene for sickle cell, or two, malaria doesn't like your blood. It doesn't want to live there, so you have a little bit of immunity, partial immunity to malaria, and malaria is a big problem in lots of places in the world. But it doesn't produce a new feature or function. It just lowers your chances of getting sick with a disease. Okay, maybe a good thing, I guess. Except it is definitely not considered an advantage by people who have it, especially if they have true sickle cell anemia, two bad copies of the gene, but even if they have sickle cell trait. I can tell you, because treating patients before, it gives them severe disadvantages. They're not going to be going anywhere at high altitude because they can't breathe. And if you've ever seen anybody in a true sickle cell crisis, you talk about some agonizing pain, they'll take malaria any day, I guarantee. So people who have sickle cell anemia or trait, they would beg to differ that this is an advantage. But here's the other thing: it's not a survival advantage, okay? And that's the whole basis of the evolutionary theory. If it were, you would see more and more of the population. By now, we would virtually all be carriers of sickle cell, at least the trait, because it would be a survival advantage. And yet it's not increasing in the population because it's not a survival advantage, so it doesn't meet any of the criteria. But that's one of the big examples still, after all this time. Well, a more recent one is so-called nylon-eating bacteria. And I won't embarrass him by saying his name. I have to credit a dear friend of mine for bringing this to my attention. But here's the thing: after I started researching it quite thoroughly, there are some bacteria that can, inefficiently, but they can metabolize or digest nylon. And nylon was only invented and synthesized in, I don't know, maybe the early 1950s or something like that, I guess. But here's the thing: no one can actually agree what the mutation is. Some people think it's a point mutation of a base substitution, kind of like we did on our illustration. Others think that it's what's called a frame shift mutation, that something's just being misread. Nobody can even agree what the mutation is. So how is it supposed to be a great example of a beneficial mutation? All right, but never mind that. There's no way to know that it occurred after the invention of nylon. That's pure assumption. This may be the way that bacteria has been, for the last 5,000 years. We just didn't know it till somebody invented nylon. So we don't even know that it's actually a recent mutation. Third, there's a corresponding loss of other function. The bacteria don't work as well with other things, and that's what you almost always see. Fourth, the metabolism of the nylon is extremely inefficient, although, look, I'll be the first to say that doesn't rule it out. It doesn't have to be a huge advantage, only a survival advantage. But that's the last thing. It's not a survival advantage. The nylon-eating bacteria are not becoming more prevalent among the bacterial population. For many, many reasons, it's not a good example. But that's what we got. I'm going to close, though, with this, and we'll pick this up next week. But you hear, though, but hey, look, we've all heard, if you gave 1 million monkeys a typewriter and they just typed at random for 1 million years, I mean, one of them eventually would just randomly produce the collected works of Shakespeare, right? Well, we've not only done the studies, but somebody finally did the math. By the way, if you give a monkey a keyboard, research shows that they tend to break it in half and then urinate on it, but never mind that. Let's suppose you could get them to type. Yet when somebody finally did the math, it doesn't take 1 million years if you have 1 million monkeys pecking away at that. Actually, it would take about 23 trillion years. And in 1 million years, what you would get out of Shakespeare's collected works, it was about 78 characters, I believe is what it was, about half of a text message length. When you actually do the math, it doesn't sound so good anymore, does it? So there's the problem. Will we take Mr. Darwin's advice, and because the fossil record in no way supports his theory, will we rightly reject it just like he himself said we ought to do? Let's see, and we'll pick it up next time, what Dr. Gould, who you saw a few moments ago, let's see what he did with this fatal flaw in the theory as we move on to the contradictory evidence. Thank you for being with us this evening. I look forward to next time in our last 2 sessions as we wrap this up, and I hope you have a great week ahead.
Thank you for joining us online. Starting this Wednesday, September the 2nd, we will return to our regular schedule of services. Masks are required at the 8:15 worship service. Masks are also required at all other times in all parts of the building except when seated in the designated sections of the auditorium or when seated in the designated classrooms. Please come worship with us or join us again online for our next service. Again, thank you for joining us online.